The evening shift at Ember's Rest was usually predictable. Riley Carter had the routine down to a science after 2 years of slinging fancy meals to whoever could afford the premium prices on Nexus Prime Station. Tuesdays meant the business crowd, traders finalizing deals over expensive wine. The Keldron loved their spiced dishes extra hot. The Centaurians always complained about portion sizes no matter what you brought them. But nothing could have prepared her for what walked through those doors at 7:15. The automatic entrance hissed open, and Riley glanced up from wiping down table 7, expecting another group of office workers. Instead, the usual dinner chatter cut off like someone had hit a mute button. Forks froze halfway to mouths. Conversations died mid-sentence. 3 figures ducked through the doorway and Riley understood why. They were massive. Not just tall, but built like they could punch through the station's hull plating if they felt like it. Dracari. The dragon-like aliens that most species whispered about in scared voices. Their scales caught the soft amber lighting of the restaurant, gleaming like polished armor. But it wasn't the shine that made Riley's stomach do a nervous flip. It was the scars. Deep gouges ran across their shoulders and arms, old wounds that had healed into raised ridges. These weren't just any Dracari. These were warriors. Veterans who had seen real combat, the kind that left marks. The lead one stopped just inside the entrance, his head swiveling slowly across the restaurant. He stood at least 8 feet tall, maybe more. His scales were deep crimson, darker than the usual bright red of younger Dracari, like old blood. His eyes, golden and slitted like a reptile's, scanned every table, every exit, every person. The way a soldier checks a room. The way someone who's survived ambushes learns to never trust a space until they've mapped it. Riley watched her co-workers suddenly discover urgent business in the kitchen. Tommy, who usually fought her for the high-tip tables, practically sprinted toward the dish station. Beth grabbed an empty tray and disappeared through the back doors. Even Marcus, the shift manager who prided himself on handling difficult customers, found something fascinating to examine on his data pad. Great. Just perfect. Riley set down her cleaning rag and grabbed 3 of the oversized menus they kept for larger species. Her hands wanted to shake, but she'd learned a long time ago how to hide nerves behind a smile. Working customer service on a space station taught you that fast. Half the species out here could smell fear and the other half just enjoyed watching you squirm. She walked across the dining room, aware that every eye in the place was now watching her. The normal background noise of the restaurant had been replaced by thick, uncomfortable silence. Even the kitchen sound seemed muted. "Good evening, gentlemen," Riley said, forcing her voice to stay steady and professional. She'd used this exact tone 1,000 times before. The one that said she was friendly but not pushover friendly. Helpful but not nervous. "Welcome to Ember's Rest. I'm Riley and I'll be taking care of you tonight. Can I start you off with some drinks?" The lead Dracari turned those golden eyes on her. Up close she could see more details. A scar running through his left eye ridge. Smaller marks along his neck. This wasn't someone who'd gotten into a bar fight. This was someone who'd survived wars. His voice when he spoke was surprisingly calm. Deep as thunder but controlled. "Water. Cold. 3. Not a lot of words but Riley would take it. "Absolutely. I'll be right back with those." She jotted it down on her order pad even though she didn't need to. 3 waters. Not exactly complicated. But the small action gave her shaking hands something to do. Around them, she could feel the other diners trying very hard to look like they weren't staring while absolutely staring. The Keldron couple at table 4 had their heads bent together, whispering. The human businessman at the bar kept glancing over his shoulder. Riley headed to the service station and grabbed 3 of the large containers they kept for species with higher body temperatures. The Dracari ran hot, literally. Their metabolism was like a furnace. They needed cold drinks or they'd overheat in climate-controlled stations like this one. She loaded the containers onto her tray along with 3 glasses, added extra ice just to be safe and headed back. Her heart was still doing that annoying flutter thing but her hands were steady now. Just another table. Just another group of customers. Never mind that they could probably tear the table in half without trying hard. As she approached she could see them sitting ramrod straight, not relaxed at all. The lead one had positioned himself with his back to the wall, eyes on the entrance. The other 2 flanked him, creating a triangle formation. Even sitting down for dinner they moved like a military unit. Riley set down the first glass and started pouring from the container. The ice crackled as the cold water hit it. She was halfway through filling the glass when her eyes caught on something. There, running down the commander's massive forearm, was a pattern. At first she thought it was just more scars, the arm was covered in them. But this was different. Deliberate. Intricate lines that wove together, part raised scar tissue, part tattoo ink, creating a design that looked like flames consuming stars. The patterns spiraled from his wrist up past his elbow, disappearing under his sleeve. Riley's hand stopped moving. The water kept pouring, starting to overflow the glass. She knew that pattern. Had seen it before. Her mother had the exact same design tattooed on her left shoulder blade. Riley had asked about it once as a kid, and her mom had gone quiet in that way she did when she was remembering something painful. All she'd said was that it was from her service days. That it meant she'd been somewhere important. Somewhere she couldn't talk about. The commander noticed her staring. His eyes narrowed and a low rumble started in his chest. Not quite a growl, but close enough to make every survival instinct in Riley's body scream at her to back away. To apologize. To look down and finish pouring like a smart person would. But her mouth had other ideas. My mom has your tattoo. The words came out before she could stop them. Quiet but clear enough that the two other Dracari heard. Clear enough that the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Clear enough that Riley knew with absolute certainty that she'd just stepped into something way bigger than a waitressing shift. The commander's claws scraped against the metal table, leaving thin scratches in the surface. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. And Riley realized she just made either the best or worst decision of her life. The sound of those claws scraping against metal made Riley's teeth hurt. It was the kind of sound that triggered something primal in the back of your brain. The thing that remembered when humans weren't at the top of the food chain. When we were prey. The two other Dracari had gone completely still. No movement at all. Their heads turned toward Riley with that unnaturally smooth motion that predators have. The kind that says they're tracking every breath you take, calculating distances and angles. Riley was very aware of how quiet the restaurant had gotten. No fork sounds. No conversation. Just the low hum of the station's air recyclers and her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. What did you say? The commander's voice came out soft. Too soft. The kind of quiet that meant danger, not calm. Riley's mouth had gone dry, but there was no taking the words back now. She'd already stepped off the cliff. Might as well commit to the fall. That mark on your arm. My mom had the same one. Exact same pattern. I've seen it my whole life. The Dracari on the left shifted in his seat. His scales were darker than the commander's, almost black in places, with silver scars running across his chest. When he spoke, his voice sounded like gravel grinding together. That is impossible. That is the mark of the 7th Fleet. Only those who fought at Crying Suns bear it. Riley felt her stomach twist. She'd heard that name before. Crying Suns. Her mom had woken up from nightmares screaming it. Had traced that tattoo with shaking fingers on bad days. Had gone silent and distant whenever anyone asked about her service record. I know, Riley said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. My mom told me about it before she died. Not everything. But enough. The commander leaned forward, and Riley had to lock her knees to keep from backing up. He was so close now she could see the individual scales on his face, each one edged with what looked like old burned scars. His breath smelled like sulfur and something metallic. His golden eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel pinned in place. Human, he said, and there was something dangerous in his tone now. Something that made the hair on the back of Riley's neck stand up. Your species was barely capable of orbital flight 30 years ago. You had just made first contact. You were not at Crying Suns. The Galactic Council had deemed you too. He paused, and Riley could see him choosing his words carefully. Too primitive for military operations. There it was. That word. Primitive. Riley had heard it her entire life growing up on Nexus Prime Station. Whispered by Keldron merchants who thought humans were too stupid to notice. Said outright by Centaurian administrators who treated human workers like children playing dress-up. Implied by every species that had been traveling the stars for centuries while humans were still figuring out how to build proper spacecraft. She'd learned to ignore it mostly. Learned to smile and nod and do her job. But something about hearing it now, about her mom, made anger flare hot in her chest. Yeah, well, Riley said, and she didn't bother keeping the edge out of her voice anymore. The council didn't ask my mom what she thought about that. They didn't ask if she wanted to stay primitive. She was there. And unless I'm completely crazy, so were you. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her tablet from her apron pocket. She had to try twice to unlock it because her fingers weren't cooperating. Around her, she could feel the entire restaurant watching. Probably half of them had their own recording devices out by now. This would be all over the station feeds by tomorrow. Riley scrolled through her photo archives. Her mom hadn't kept much from those days. Most of the records had been classified, locked away in some Galactic Council database that humans weren't supposed to access. But there were a few things. Personal items. A couple of photos that had somehow escaped the purge. She found the one she was looking for. The image was old and grainy, taken on Earth equipment that was ancient even by human standards. The colors were washed out, the resolution terrible. But you could still make out what mattered. A woman in her late 20s stood in what looked like a field hospital. Her dark hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat and probably blood. The combat suit she wore was torn in places, stained with things Riley didn't want to think about. Her face was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that came from days without sleep. But her eyes were alert, focused, staring at something off camera. Around her were bodies. Some on makeshift cots. Some on the floor. Wounded soldiers from species Riley had learned about in school. Keldron with their 6 limbs bandaged. A Vorith missing part of its carapace. 2 Centaurians leaning on each other for support. And in the background, sitting on what looked like a supply crate while someone worked on his side, was a younger Dracari. His scales were brighter red then, not yet darkened with age. But the bone structure of his face was identical. The set of his jaw. The way he held his shoulders. Riley turned the tablet around with hands that were definitely shaking now. All 3 Dracari stared at the screen. Nobody moved. The commander reached out slowly, almost reverently with one massive claw. He touched the screen like he was afraid the image might disappear if he pressed too hard. Or like he couldn't quite believe it was real. "Dr. Amy Harper," he said softly, and there was something in his voice Riley had never heard from a Dracari before. Something that sounded almost like grief. The medic who refused to run. Riley felt her throat tighten. She nodded, not trusting her voice for a moment. When she finally spoke, it came out as barely more than a whisper. "That's my mom." The silence that followed felt heavy enough to crush her. The commander's claw was still touching the screen, tracing the outline of her mother's face. The other 2 Dracari had leaned in to look, their expressions unreadable. Finally, the dark-scaled one spoke. "We thought she was dead. The records said all human observers perished in the conflict." "The records lied," Riley said. Her voice was stronger now. "She made it out. Lived another 28 years. She just couldn't talk about it." Classified orders from the council. The commander pulled his hand back from the screen. He looked at Riley with those golden eyes, and she realized he was seeing her differently now. Not as just some human waitress. As something else. Someone connected to a past he'd thought was buried forever. "Tell me," he said quietly. "How much do you know about crying suns?" Riley swallowed hard. "Probably not enough. But I know it mattered. I know she never regretted being there. And I know that mark on your arm meant she was part of something the galaxy decided to forget." The commander nodded slowly. Then he did something Riley didn't expect. He gestured to the empty chair at their table. "Sit," he said. "There are things you should know about your mother. Things the council does not want told." Riley glanced back at her manager, who was staring at her with wide eyes from across the restaurant. He made a frantic gesture that she interpreted as either, "Get back to work," or, "Do whatever they say." Given the circumstances, she chose to interpret it as the latter. She pulled out the chair and sat down across from 3 of the most dangerous warriors in the galaxy, her mother's photo still glowing on the tablet screen between them. And that's when they started talking about the battle that officially never happened. The commander, he'd introduced himself as Draker when Riley sat down, pushed his water glass aside like he'd forgotten it existed. His golden eyes had gone distant, unfocused, looking at something far beyond the restaurant walls. Something 30 years in the past. "The Battle of Crying Suns was an ambush," he began, and his voice carried through the silent restaurant. Riley realized nobody was even pretending to eat anymore. Forks sat abandoned on plates. Conversations had died completely. Every being in the place was listening. The Kreshtar swarm had been quiet for months. Intelligence said they'd retreated to their breeding grounds in the Outer Rim. "We thought we had time. We were wrong." His claws tapped against the table, a nervous habit maybe, or just the physical memory of holding a weapon. "They caught us in a dead system. We'd stopped there to refuel. It was supposed to be safe, uninhabited, nothing but a dying star and some asteroid debris. We'd lowered our shields to transfer fuel between ships faster. Standard procedure in neutral space." The second Dracari, Talus, he'd said his name was, leaned forward. His scales were darker than Draker's, with silver scars that caught the light. 23 Kreshtar ships dropped out of hyperspace right on top of us. We had 11 vessels. The math wasn't good. Riley felt her chest tighten. She'd learned about the Kreshtar in school. Insectoid species, hive-minded, and absolutely brutal in combat. They didn't take prisoners. Didn't negotiate. They just swarmed and overwhelmed. Our medical frigates were destroyed in the first wave, Draker continued, and there was old anger in his voice now. The Kreshtar knew what they were doing. Take out medical support first, let the wounded pile up, destroy morale. It's effective strategy. Talus picked up the story without missing a beat, like they'd told this tale before, like it was burned into their memories so deep they couldn't forget even if they wanted to. Most of the medical personnel evacuated on escape pods within the first hour. Standard military protocol. Non-combat staff are too valuable to risk in active battle zones. Medics especially. You lose your medical corps, you lose everything. Riley's throat felt tight. She could picture it. The chaos. The panic. Ships exploding. People dying. And somewhere in that mess, her mom. Your mother was only supposed to be an observer, Draker said, and something like wonder crept into his voice. Earth had just made first contact 6 months earlier. The Council had sent a few human specialists to document military operations, to learn how Galactic Defense Forces operated. Your mother was a trauma surgeon from Earth, assigned to shadow our medical teams. She wasn't supposed to do anything. Just watch. Take notes. Learn. Nobody expected her to fight, Talus added. Riley shook her head. She didn't fight, she said quietly, remembering conversations with her mom late at night. The way she talked about it in fragments, pieces of a story she wasn't supposed to tell. No, Draker agreed, and his expression shifted into something Riley couldn't quite read. Respect maybe. Admiration. She did something harder. She stayed. The third Drackery finally spoke. He'd been silent up until now, just listening, his eyes fixed on Riley's tablet where her mother's photo still glowed. His voice came out rough like he didn't use it often. 72 hours that battle lasted. 3 full days. And that human medic worked without stopping the entire time. Riley tried to imagine it. 3 days straight. No rest. In the middle of a war zone. No sleep, the third Drackery continued. Barely any food. I saw her drink water a few times, but only when someone physically put a container in her hands. She treated everyone who came through those doors. Didn't matter what species. Didn't matter which side they'd been fighting on. If they were bleeding, she stopped it. If they were dying, she fought for them. Talus gestured with one clawed hand, his voice growing more animated. She had no training in alien physiology. None. Human medical schools don't exactly teach Drackery anatomy or Keldron organ placement. But she learned as she went. I watched her cut into a Vorith soldier. Their biology is completely different from mammals, their internal structure makes no sense, and she just adapted. Used human techniques and modified them in real time. Trial and error, except the errors meant someone died. Draker's claw touched the mark on his arm, tracing the pattern of flames and stars. I took shrapnel in my side. Deep penetration close to vital organs. I was bleeding out and we had no medics left. Your mother found me in a corridor already half dead. She dragged me to the makeshift hospital she'd set up in a cargo bay. His voice went quieter. I ordered her to leave. The battle was going badly. We all knew it. The order had come down for non-essential personnel to evacuate. I told her she'd done more than enough, that she'd earned her spot on those escape pods. That Earth needed her to survive. Riley held her breath, knowing what was coming but needing to hear it anyway. She looked at me, Draker said, and there was something raw in his voice now. Something that sounded like it still hurt after 30 years. Looked me right in the eyes and said, I didn't come to space to run away. I came to help. The third Drackery made a sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something else. Then she cut into him with a scalpel designed for human tissue. Drackery scales are harder than most species' armor plating. That little blade shouldn't have worked. But she made it work through sheer determination. She saved 47 lives that day, Talus said. We counted afterward. 47 soldiers from 6 different species who would have died without her. And she did it with equipment designed for humans in a cargo bay that was falling apart, while the ship shook from weapons fire. Draker looked directly at Riley. Your mother was supposed to be primitive. That's what the Council had said. Humans were too emotional, too fragile, too new to contribute anything meaningful. But she proved them wrong. She showed more courage in those 72 hours than some warriors show in their entire careers. Riley felt her eyes burning. She'd known her mom was special. Had known the tattoo meant something important. But hearing it like this, from warriors who'd been there, made it real in a way it had never been before. What happened after? Riley asked. After the battle ended? The three Dracari exchanged glances. Something passed between them, some shared understanding that made Riley's stomach sink. That, Draker said grimly, is where the story gets complicated. Riley's mind was spinning. 47 lives. 3 days of hell. Her mother had been a hero and nobody knew. Nobody except the people who were there. So why didn't anyone know? The question burst out of her before she could stop it. Why isn't this in the history feeds? Why isn't there a memorial or a documentary or something? Why did my mom have to keep it secret her whole life? Draker's expression went dark. The kind of dark that said he'd been angry about this for 3 decades and the anger hadn't faded one bit. Politics, he said, and the word came out like a curse. The Galactic Council had rejected humanity's application for full membership 8 months before Crying Suns. They'd reviewed Earth's technology, your social structures, your history. And they decided you weren't ready. Talus's claws drummed against the table, a sharp staccato rhythm that matched Riley's heartbeat. They called your species too emotional, too reckless, too short-lived to contribute meaningfully to galactic civilization. They said humans were impulsive, couldn't think long-term, couldn't be trusted with real responsibility. Riley had heard all this before. Growing up on the station, she'd faced it constantly. The subtle dismissals. The way other species treated human workers like they were playing at being spacefaring. Like they were children wearing their parents' clothes, pretending to be grown-ups. The Council gave Earth observer status, the third Dracari said, his rough voice cutting through her thoughts. Limited access. A few humans allowed to shadow operations and learn. Your mother was one of them. She was there to watch and take notes. Nothing more. Draker leaned forward, his massive frame making the chair creak. Then Crying Suns happened. And this primitive human medic, this observer who wasn't supposed to do anything, showed more dedication than medical corps from species with centuries of military tradition. She saved 47 lives. 47 soldiers who would have died without her. She worked harder and longer than medics who'd trained for decades. The bitterness in his voice was thick enough to taste. Riley could see where this was going, and her stomach was already twisting with anger she hadn't fully processed yet. The Council couldn't admit they'd been wrong, Talus said flatly. They'd just spent months explaining to the entire galaxy why humans weren't ready. Why Earth needed more time. Why your species couldn't handle the responsibility of membership. Then one human proved them completely wrong in the most public way possible. So they buried it, Riley said. The pieces were clicking together now and she hated every single one of them. They classified everything, the third Dracari confirmed. Sealed the records under national security protocols. Called it a matter of strategic importance. Then they went to every survivor and ordered us to never speak of the humans' involvement. Draker's claws scraped the table again, leaving fresh grooves next to the old ones. They told us it would complicate diplomatic relations. That revealing a human had been in combat operations would create problems with Earth's integration process. That it was better for everyone if this stayed quiet. Riley felt heat rising in her chest. Her mom had saved lives, had done something incredible, and they'd erased her from history because it was inconvenient. Because admitting she'd been amazing meant admitting they'd been wrong about humanity. We complied, Draker said, and now there was real anger in his voice. The kind that had been simmering for 30 years. Out of respect for the political process. Because we believed it was necessary. Because we thought maybe the Council knew better than us. He shook his head. But we never forgot. None of us who were there forgot what she did. Riley looked down at her tablet, at her mother's exhausted face in that old photo. My mom earned her own version of the mark, she said quietly. Got it tattooed 6 months after the battle. She said it was to honor the soldiers she'd served with, even if she couldn't talk about them publicly. She looked up at the 3 massive warriors sitting across from her. She died 2 years ago. Complications from exposure during the battle. They didn't have proper protective gear for humans on those ships. 72 hours breathing toxic air, surrounded by chemicals her body wasn't designed to handle. The doctors said it damaged her lungs. She got sick 5 years later and it just kept getting worse. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on the table. Riley could see genuine grief in Draker's eyes. These warriors had known her mom. Had fought beside her. And they'd been ordered to never speak her name. She never regretted it, Riley added, and her voice cracked slightly. Even when she was dying, hooked up to oxygen machines, barely able to breathe. She said those 3 days were the most important thing she'd ever done. That she'd do it again without hesitation. Draker stood slowly. The movement was deliberate, careful. Riley tensed instinctively. You didn't spend 2 years serving Drackery without learning to respect their size and strength. But instead of anger or aggression, Draker placed his clawed hand over his heart. It was a formal gesture, one Riley recognized from newscasts about military ceremonies. A formal salute. Your mother was a warrior, he said, and his voice carried through the entire restaurant. Not with weapons but with something more important. She had courage. Real courage. The kind that doesn't run when things get hard. The kind that stays when everyone else leaves. Around the restaurant, Riley heard chairs scraping against the floor. She turned to look and felt her breath catch. The other patrons, Keldron with their 6 limbs, towering Vorith, even a few Centaurians who usually looked down on everyone, were rising to their feet. Standing. Showing respect. Talus stood as well, adding his voice to Draker's. Everyone at Crying Suns knew about her. The human medic who refused to leave. We called her the Stubborn Star. Because she burned brighter than anyone else when it mattered most. The third Drackery rose last, his rough voice somehow gentle. And any establishment that serves her daughter serves a hero's family. Riley sat there, surrounded by standing aliens, her mother's photo still glowing on her tablet, and felt tears finally starting to break through. Tears she'd been holding back since her mom died. Since the funeral where nobody really understood what had been lost. Since all those years of watching her mom struggle to breathe and knowing it was because she'd been a hero nobody was allowed to remember. Draker looked around the restaurant, making eye contact with every patron who'd stood. The time for silence is over, he announced. Dr. Amy Harper saved my life 30 years ago. She saved all of us. And the galaxy will know her name. Retry DD. Riley showed up for her shift the next day with a knot in her stomach. She hadn't slept much. Her mind kept replaying the conversation, the photo, Draker's voice saying her mother's name like it was sacred. She expected the restaurant to be back to normal. Expected the usual Tuesday crowd, the same boring routine. Instead, 3 massive Drackery were waiting outside the entrance. Riley stopped dead in her tracks. Draker, Talus, and the third one, who'd finally introduced himself as Keth, stood in the morning light filtering through the station's viewport. They looked different somehow. More formal. They'd changed into what looked like ceremonial armor, deep red and black, polished until it gleamed. We need you to come with us, Draker said. Riley's first instinct was to ask why, but before she could get the words out, her manager came rushing through the door. Voss was a nervous Keldron who jumped at loud noises and apologized to customers even when they were clearly wrong. Right now he looked like he might pass out from stress. Go, go. Voss practically shoved her toward the Drackery with 4 of his 6 arms flailing. Whatever they want, you give it to them. Take the day off. Take the week off. Just go. So Riley went. They led her through the station's main corridors and people stared. You didn't see 3 Drackery in full ceremonial armor every day, and you definitely didn't see them escorting a human waitress like she was someone important. Riley caught snippets of whispered conversations as they passed. Some people had already heard about yesterday. Word traveled fast on a space station. They took her to one of the quiet observation decks on the upper level. The kind of place where important business happened, where station officials met with visiting dignitaries. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the central hub, where ships came and went like glowing fireflies against the black of space. Draker gestured for Riley to stand by the window. Then he reached into a secured case that Keth had been carrying. The locks on it looked serious, military-grade, probably keyed to Draker's genetic signature. When it opened, Riley heard a soft hiss like it had been vacuum-sealed. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a medal. It wasn't like the military decorations Riley had seen in history vids. Those were usually simple, efficient, designed to be mass-produced. This was different. This was art. The metal gleamed even in the dim observation deck lighting, catching every photon and throwing it back transformed. Platinum alloy unless Riley missed her guess. Worth more than she made in a year probably. The metal was engraved with symbols Riley couldn't read. Designs from species she didn't recognize. Some looked like writing, others like mathematical formulas, still others like abstract art. A dozen different cultures represented in one piece of metal. And in the center, dominating everything else, was a star being consumed by flames. The symbol of Crying Suns. This is the Stellar Witness Medal, Draker said quietly, and his voice had that same careful reverence it had held when he'd spoken her mother's name. The Drackery Empire's highest honor for non-citizens. It was created 30 years ago for one person. Dr. Amy Harper. Riley felt like someone had knocked the air out of her lungs. She couldn't breathe right. Couldn't think straight. That was her mom's name. Her mom's medal. We never had the chance to give it to her, Tallis explained, and Riley could hear genuine regret in his voice. The classification orders came down 3 weeks after the battle ended. We were ordered to seal all records, destroy all evidence of human involvement. But we kept this. It, hoping that someday the truth would come out. That we could present it properly. Draker lifted the medal from its case. It caught the light from the viewport and for a second, it really did look like a burning star. Your mother earned this 3 decades ago. She earned it in blood and sweat and 72 hours of refusing to give up. It's long overdue. He held it out to Riley. Her hands were shaking as she took it. The medal was heavier than she expected, solid and real in her palms. It was warm too from being held by Draker's claws, and that warmth felt important somehow. Like it was being passed from one warrior to another. Riley looked down at the medal, at all those alien symbols she couldn't read, at the burning star in the center. Her mom should have received this. Should have been honored publicly, celebrated, remembered. Instead, she died in a hospital room with barely anyone understanding what she'd done. The time for silence is over, Draker announced, and his voice carried that command authority that made people listen. The Galactic Council can object if they wish. They can threaten political consequences. They can try to bury this again. But the Drakri will no longer hide humanity's sacrifice. Your mother's story will be told. And it was. The change didn't happen overnight, but it happened fast. Within days, the story had spread across Nexus Prime Station. Someone had recorded video from the restaurant the night before. It went viral on every major network. Then other stations picked it up. Other sectors. Within a week, it had reached Earth itself. And once the story was out, other veterans started coming forward. Species Riley had never heard of, from corners of the galaxy she'd never visited. They told their own stories of human courage during those early integration years. There was a cargo hauler named Jackson who'd saved a colony ship by manually venting a reactor core while everyone else evacuated. An engineer called Chin who'd repaired critical systems on a damaged station while it was literally falling into a star. A negotiator named Patricia who'd stood between 2 warring species for 16 hours straight, refusing to move until they agreed to talk instead of shoot. Humans weren't the strongest species. Weren't the smartest or most technologically advanced. They didn't live as long as the Centaurians or fight as well as the Drakari. But when things got desperate, when the situation looked impossible, humans had this stubborn habit of staying. Riley placed the Stellar Witness medal in a display case at the Ember's Rest, right next to her mother's photo from Crying Sons. Within days, the restaurant had become something of a landmark. Veterans would stop by just to see it, to pay their respects, to share their own stories. Every time someone asked about the medal, Riley would tell them. About Dr. Amy Harper. About the medic who refused to run. About 72 hours of hell and one human who decided that political classifications and species barriers didn't matter when people were dying. She always ended the story the same way, with her mother's words. The words Draker had remembered across 3 decades. Humans didn't come to space to run away. We came to help. Those words became something bigger than her mom. Bigger than Riley. They became humanity's promise to the galaxy. A declaration that Earth wasn't asking for permission anymore, wasn't waiting for approval. Humans were here and they were staying, and when the universe needed help, they'd be there. And unlike the Galactic Council's classifications, unlike their buried records and sealed files and convenient lies, promises like that couldn't be hidden. They could only grow stronger. Retry.